So let's talk first about our sensory systems, how sensations become perceptions. Sensations are basically the detection of physical energy from the outside world, outside your body. So whenever light hits the retina in the back of your eye, whenever somebody touches your skin, and whenever a vibrating air reaches the eardrum, all of that is the initiation of sensation, basically sensing the stuff from the outside world. And then perceptions are what we make of those sensations, how we represent those sensations in our brains and in our minds. The stimuli can be sensed by your sensory organs even if you're not perceiving them. So your sensory organs are still going to be working sensing whatever it is they sense, but you, due to the way our minds work, by changing our attention to certain things, for example, we may not actually be perceiving them. So, for example, if you're sitting down right now, you've probably stopped perceiving the feeling of your butt in the chair. When you first sit down, right, you perceive that. Because you never know. You don't want to be sitting. You don't want to be sitting on something that's sharp or something that's wet and yucky, right? You sit down and your butt kind of does an initial sort of like, is this okay? Is the chair going to slip out from under me? Is there anything disgusting on this seat? But once you do that, you're not perceiving those sensations anymore. So stimuli are constantly being sensed, but whether or not we perceive them depends on a lot of things, including where we focus our attention. A sensory system are the processes a sensory system is what processes sensations coming into each sense. There's certain organs associated with each sensory system, a sense organ. And these sense organs allow us to understand and interpret all of the sensations that we receive. The common characteristics of all the sense organs is that there's receptor cells. Receptor cells are responsible for translating external energy into neural signals. External energy into neural signals. So the electromagnetic energy from the visible light that hits the back of your eye is translated to a neural signal in the rods or the cones in your eye, in your retina. The vibrations in the air that we perceive as sound, well, those vibrations in the air enter our ears, cause our eardrums to vibrate, and ultimately those vibrations are fed to a structure in our inner ear called a cochlea. The cochlea has inside of it hair cells that vibrate according to the specific frequencies and intensities that you're perceiving. And the movement of those hair cells, the vibrations of those hair cells in your cochlea are transduced into neural signals, which we ultimately perceive as sound. The receptor sounds turn all those environmental stimuli into the receptor cells. Turn those environmental stimuli into neural signals. And then once those neural signals are generated, they are fed by nerves to the appropriate areas of the brain through a nerve cell that connects to the neurons in different brain areas. So, for example, the sensory system for the visual, for our visual sense, the sense organ is, of course, the eye. And the receptor cells that do the transduction of light into neural signals are the rods and cones that are living in the retina, which is in the back of your eye. The rods and cones send their signals to ganglion cells and other types of cells that are in the retina. And ultimately, the cells in the retina conduct signals out from the back of the eye through optic nerves. And the signals go through different regions of the brain. They go into your parts of your brainstem, into your thalamus, and ultimately those process signals make their way to the back of your head, to your occipital lobe, where we start to extract the meaning from whatever it is that initially hit the nerve cells in our eye. The primary job of any sensory system is to receive the stimulus energy from the outside world, from the environment, and to recode that stimulus into something that the brain can interpret and process. The stimulus that we're receiving from the environment is usually referred to as the distal stimulus, D-I-S-T-A-L, the distal stimulus. Distal means far away. Once that distal stimulus has been represented in our minds, it becomes a proximal stimulus. And the proximal stimulus is what the brain acts on and interprets. So there's the distal stimulus out in the world. That the energy from that distal stimulus, or the energy of that distal stimulus, causes a sensation. Ultimately, those sensations are enter into our brains, where they become perceptions. And once those perceptions are represented in our minds, that perception, that representation, is referred to as a proximal stimulus. There's been a lot of different approaches to the study of perception. Obviously, it's a very complex topic. Sensation and perception is arguably the toughest topic in psychology, I think. Probably, right up there with psychometrics and all the other awful, terrible things. I teach a course in sensation perception here at UTSA, and it's a tough class because it combines physics with biology and psychology. All three of those sciences are, important in understanding sensation and perception. But there have been a lot of approaches to studying sensation and perception. One of them has been the computational approach. And really what it is this. It's where we consider how different cues in stimuli are used to interpret the environment. So in other words, we assume that these stimuli, these proximal stimuli, come in. Ultimately, these proximate stimuli are represented in our minds, and these proximate stimuli are made up of a set of cues or attributes, and we go through some process of analyzing those attributes or those cues in that stimuli to interpret what it is and its relationship to the rest of the environment. So we talk, for example, in this computational approach, we talk about the use of features of objects and scenes. In other words, the background scenes and the environment where objects appear that we use to interpret and understand them. The features of each object and where those objects appear in different scenes, of course, are instrumental in helping us to understand our world around us. The features or the cues in the environment help us to turn that distal stimulus into the proximal stimulus in our mind. So what that means is that, we basically, part of our perceptual apparatus is made up of an expectation, what we expect to see. So the cues in the environment that are telling you where you're at and what to expect are going to play a very large part in determining what you perceive out of those stimuli. Believe it or not. One of the approaches in this computational understanding, there's been two basic approaches that have been used to describe the process, the computation process behind uncovering the meaning behind stimuli. And these are known as the bottom-up processing and top-down processing. First, let's talk about bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing basically is where the perception is conducted starting with the most basic units or features of a stimulus. So basically what's happening in bottom-up processing is we are taking all of the little bits and pieces of a particular stimulus, all the different components that it's made of, and adding those little parts together so that it can help us to understand what that whole is. So it's taking all the little individual pieces, all the little individual components, and adding them all together slowly, step by step, stage by stage, until we build up to the object that we're perceiving. If you look at the Ponzo illusion, the cat on the bottom looks smaller, even though they are the same size. And the reason the cat does look smaller is because of what your brain is doing to the linear perspective of the train tracks. Basically, what's happening here is it shows how we use linear perspective cues in our environment to interpret the locations and sizes of objects. We use the way long streets or walls converge to a point at the very, far away. We use that convergence of points to judge how big things are. And you can use that illusion, you can use that factor of how our brain works to create an illusion like this Ponzo illusion. The Ponzo illusion is a great example of bottom-up processing, I think, because, it's taking the different parts, it's taking the railroad tracks as a component of the scene where these two cats are located, and then it's taking all of this, adding it all together and giving us a particular perception. In this particular instance, it's giving us a perception that one cat is bigger than the other cat. And by the way, I should mention this cat that I'm talking about. These images are in your book. I believe it's figure 3.3 in your textbook. So follow along in your textbook if you're not doing that already. So another computational approach other than bottom-up processing is the opposite, which is top-down processing. And what top-down processing is the opposite, basically, of bottom-up. And what we're doing here is we're perceiving objects, but we're not perceiving and recognizing objects by breaking them down into pieces and then putting the pieces together. No. We are perceiving those objects based on our prior knowledge of objects like it. So basically what we're doing is we're perceiving and categorizing objects based on our prior experience with perceiving and categorizing other objects that are like it. So as you're walking through a room, for example, imagine yourself walking through a room, and there's a chair there. Now, your brain is not going to spend a lot of time breaking that chair down into, the poles and the flat surfaces, and then organizing all of that together, and then deciding, oh, that's a chair. Probably what's happening with the chair is that since you're walking indoors and you're walking through a room, one of the expectations that you have is that you're going to see chairs. So you're already primed to see chairs, and not only that, you know what chairs look like. So when you see a chair, immediately your brain knows that's a chair. And this is through prior experience being indoors and other places that has furniture and that has similar things like chairs in it. This leads us down to another path. Whenever we're looking and perceiving objects and their locations in space, one of the things that's become quite obvious is that we make unconscious inferences about the world when we perceive it. In other words, we're not constantly consciously and constantly trying to figure out what things are, right? We automatically, unconsciously sort of infer what we expect to see. If you think about it, think about, when you're driving to and from school, when you're driving to and from work, when you're in your house, going to the kitchen to get a snack or whatever, think about, you don't spend a lot of time processing the things that are there, right? If they haven't changed, your brain just sort of constructs them and unconsciously, and you kind of know they're there. The only way you pay attention to things is if things have been moved around or things have changed. Then you focus on it. You say, oh, that cabinet used to be over there, but it looks like Dad moved it over here. Or you're walking and, you're just kind of walking along and maybe the light's not so good, but, you walk and you know where you're stepping because you know your room really well. But all of a sudden you step on you step on a Lego and it hurts, right? You weren't expecting that, and it's going to hurt a lot. And you're definitely going to pay attention to it, but it wasn't part of your, normal routine. It wasn't something that you'd experienced before. And so you were just sort of constructing this unconscious representation of your world. This is the theory of unconscious inference. Essentially, we use top-down processing to unconsciously to perceive and interpret the environment. So a lot of top-down processing is having prior experience, knowing what that prior experience is, and then using that prior experiences to set up expectations about what we expect to perceive in the environment, and then using those expectations to build our perceptions. Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example of how your brain sort of fills in the blanks. So I know you're not supposed to look at your phone when you're driving, right? But, everybody does. But imagine yourself pulled up to a light. You've pulled up to a light, and that light's going to take like a minute. It's going to be a really long light, right? So you look down at your phone, and you're looking down and you're going through your phone. But what most of us do is when we're doing that and we're at a light is we kind of have like our attention semi-focused on the car in front of us, right? Because you want to start rolling as soon as the car moves, right? But realize this, you're looking at your phone. So your brain is actively processing the information, probably using bottom-up processing, but as well as top-down, because you're reading something on your phone. All of the other surrounding stimuli, you're not paying attention to it. You're not paying attention to it. So your brain is basically just filling in the blanks based on what you expect. So your brain is filling in the blanks, putting that car in front of you while you're looking at your phone. And then what happens, right? You hear a beep from the guy behind you. You look up and the car in front of you is like 20 or 30 yards ahead. You're like, and you didn't see it move. And the reason you didn't perceive it move is because you weren't focused on it. Your brain was not focused on it. Your brain was using unconscious inference to sort of fill in the gaps while you were busy looking at your phone. Another approach to understanding, perception is what is called the Gestalt approach. And the Gestaltists were a bunch of crazy Germans back in the 20s and 30s and 40s who decided that one of the ways to understand perception is to understand how our minds perceive objects as a whole, right? So Gestaltists are really big on top-down processing. It's a very key component of how Gestaltists think about things. But really, instead of breaking things down into little analytical pieces and putting them back together, Gestaltists understood that when we're looking at a scene or understanding what's going on visually in front of us, we're not breaking things down into individual components. We're taking it all in as a whole and analyzing that whole perception as an entire thing, right? As an entire whole, right? For example, if you're sitting, if you're in a classroom and you're listening to a lecture, your brain is not, processing, this particular projector screen, right? White projector screen. And then your brain is not perceiving the drawing, the whiteboard that is used and the individual markers. You're not focusing on the individual markers that are used for the board. You're not focused on, the individual, bricks that make up the wall. You're not focused on the different desks. You don't focus on the parts. What you're perceiving is, I'm in a classroom, and this classroom has boards and projectors and desks and a professor. And it constructs all of that for you without you having to go and analyze the pieces down piece by piece by piece by piece. Unless, of course, you want to, right? Unless, of course, you get up and you write down the different color markers the professor's using and the make and model of the desks. I mean, if you do that, you're crazy. But generally, most normal people don't do that, right? You just sort of like perceive as a whole, I'm in a classroom, and this classroom has whiteboard markers instead of chalkboard and a projector, and there's a professor there, and it's pretty much all I need to know. The Gestaltists understood this and tried to understand a little bit better some of the principles that this sort of holistic perception worked by. And they wanted to understand the organizational principles of the world. In other words, the organizational principles that allowed us to interpret the stimuli in our environment. One of the quotes that's always associated with Gestaltists is, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This thing might be made of parts X, Y, and Z, but we're perceiving it as something greater, something more meaningful to us. One of the Gestalt principles that they introduced is the principle of similarity. So they notice that we tend to group objects or features of a scene based on their similarity. So if you are, if you're looking at a video or you're at the Riverwalk in San Antonio and you're watching, you're watching a mama duck in the river with her duckling swimming behind her, you're not perceiving, your brain is not registering and perceiving, 11 individual little ducks and one big duck, right? Your brain is perceiving a clutch of baby ducks with a mama duck, and you're grouping them together, and your brain is assuming that all those little guys are together and they belong together in some reason because they all look the same. Proximity, we tend to group objects or features of a scene based on their proximity to one another. So things that are close together, we group them together as a whole. So we do this when we're in traffic. When you're driving in traffic, one of the things that you get used to once you've, starting to become a better and better driver is you're not focused on individual cars so much. You're really focused on the groups of cars and the flow of a group of cars moving. And we do that through this Gestalt principle of proximity. We're focused on the cars that are closest together as a group of cars. And so we wait for that group of cars to move off before we, for example, attempt to change lanes or whatever. Another principle of a Gestalt principle is continuation, or good continuation. And this is our understanding that objects continue even if parts of them are occluded. So, for example, if you're looking at a house, but the house has a great big gigantic tree growing in front of it, your brain fills in the gaps. Your brain knows that behind that tree is the rest of the house. It's not, that part of the house isn't gone, right? It's still there, and your brain knows this. If I pass a pencil behind a card, an index card, and then the pencil comes, if I hold an index card up in front of you and then pass a pencil, behind the index card, and you only see the eraser of the pencil when it's behind the index card, well, you're not assuming that the pencil disappeared, right? Similarly, if I draw a line on a piece of paper and then skip a little space and continue to draw that line, and skip a little space and continue to draw that line. I've got 3 straight lines that are lined up perfectly on the same, right on the same line. You're not perceiving that as necessarily as 3 separate lines. You could perceive that as one line with a couple of strips of paper laid down on top of it, for example. So that's what continuation is. Closure allows us another Gestalt concept principle, I should say, is closure, which allows us to view incomplete objects as whole. So if somebody has their back to you, right, and you know that there's a front to them, right? That they are a whole person. If part of going back to the example of the house and the tree, if part of a house is obscured by a tree, or if part of a building, let's say you're in New York City and you're looking at all these buildings and you can only see the top of a building that's behind another building, well, that there's a building back there. That it's a complete building because of this principle of closure. The principle of pragnance, one of my favorite words to say, pragnance, is this is an extremely complicated principle. Well, it's not, but to me, it's kind of complicated. Read what your book says and make up your own mind. But the principle of pragnance basically says that we perceive scenes as simply as possible. In other words, we will not add any more objects or components or complexity to a scene than is necessary. We build that scene as simply as possible and don't add any more extra stuff to it. So it sounds simple, right? But if you think about it, there's a lot of unconscious inference that goes into that. A lot. I mean, if you think about it. And I'm guessing that a lot of that unconscious inference is due in large part to our past experience. Another Gestalt principle that's mentioned in your book is the configural superiority. The configural superiority effect. So the configural superiority effect, there's a great example in your textbook there where basically what this says is that the more complex arrangements of things that you have in a particular scene with, angles and all kinds of things, the easier it is. The easier it is to detect differences or to detect individual parts of that particular scene. For example, like let's say I have an array of a bunch of slanted lines, and so I have lines that are slanted at I guess 45 degrees, and let's say I have a whole bunch of those lines, and I have rows and rows of those lines, and let's say I'm showing you 100 of these lines on a page. Each one's in a little box, in a little imaginary box, and you see 100 of these. But one of those lines is slanted in the opposite direction, and it's just the lines. That's all you see. It's going to be a lot harder for you to detect the one unslanted line than if I were to include maybe a box around each one of those lines, or maybe a X and Y axis attached to one of those lines. If I were to put some sort of little reference points around each line, make it more complex, in other words, it would be much more easier for you to find the oddball line, right? And that's basically what this principle is. It says that it's easier for us to find and to perceive stimuli that have lots of different features and reference points that we can understand. The Gestalt approach, this whole approach to understanding perception, grew out of the idea that perception is more than just interpreting cues in the environment. It's more than just, taking this cue plus this cue plus this cue equals this perception. It's a lot more than that. There's a lot of unconscious processing that goes on, a lot of putting in our expectations, our prior experience, our prior learning. All of that goes into creating our perceptions. Another approach to understanding perception is my favorite one, the perception action approach. And what this is that, okay, the researchers that take this approach say, okay, why are we perceiving things? Right? Why are we perceiving things? What's the purpose of our brains, sitting there perceiving our sights and sounds and smells? Well, it's so we can do stuff. It's so we can get stuff done. So I'm perceiving the furniture in the room and the doors in the wall and where the walls are and where the stairs are. I'm perceiving all of that so I can do what? So I can move around. So one of the important aspects of this perception action approach is to understand not only what it is that you're perceiving, but why you're perceiving it, what you're going to do with that thing that you're perceiving. One of the concepts associated with the perception action approach is something called affordances. Affordances are possible behaviors that you can do in a given environment or with a given object. So for example, if you perceive a chair, well, your perception of a chair is going to be based a lot more than just the shape of the thing, right? The way it's shaped. Your perception of a chair is going to be heavily based upon what you've done with chairs before, and that is you've sat on them. So you're going to know exactly what that thing is, what it's for, how to approach it, and how to use it. All of that's going to be that. All of that adds up to the affordances that are associated with that particular chair. Another important concept associated with the perception action approach is that perception and action are linked to each other. You have to understand what you're going to do with a particular thing you're perceiving, as well as the thing itself. Right? So we perceive things differently based on how we're going to use them, how we're going to operate them. For example, here's an example. We handle drink cups very differently if the drink is a hot drink or a cold drink. Think about that. Think about the way you handle a hot drink versus a cold drink. The way you consume a hot drink versus a cold drink. All of that is based upon our behaviors toward that particular drink. From the way we hold the cup to the way we consume it. Our behaviors are altered based on whether or not it's a hot drink or a cold drink. Have you ever picked up what you thought was a hot drink, like a hot tea or hot coffee, and then drank it and it was cold? Your brain whoa, wait, what was that? You're kind of like, yuck. And it immediately hits you that, this is not hot. This is not correct. So perception and action are very linked to each other. It's the only way to understand perception ultimately is to understand what actions are associated with it. This has actually helped us quite a lot in robotics, to dealing with programming machines to understand the environment. One of the things that we've begun doing is incorporating what the machine is going to do with particular things. That helps a lot in robotics. The perception action approach has its roots in ecological psychology. In other words, the psychology of interacting with the environment and how the environment affects our perceptions and our behaviors. This was suggested by James Gibson. He was the guy who basically invented this whole thing. If I would strongly recommend that you read up on James Gibson if you can. Go to his Wikipedia page. He's a very, very cool theorist. Very cool ideas. The judgments about the environment can also be influenced by our current bodily state. So, for example, your perceptions about climbing a set of stairs are going to be altered based on how tired you are, right? You're certainly you're gonna perceive those stairs as being more challenging versus if you're not tired. Hunger. Hunger is a very famous one, right? Hunger can definitely alter your perceptions of different food smells, and alter the way, you perceive things. So, when you're super hungry and if you've been deprived of food for a long time, that McDonald's hamburger and fries is going to be like a gourmet meal versus if you were normal, you were a normal American, a normal fat American like me, and McDonald's hamburger is just a McDonald's hamburger. The perception is going to be very different. There's an enormous amount of brain evidence associated with the perception action approach. A lot of this has generated an enormous amount of research over the last 20 or 30 years or so. And it's controversial, I guess. Your book says it's controversial. I guess it is. Well, it is because there's a lot of data. There's a lot of data, and some of it is a lot of it contradicts each other. So we're still trying to figure things out. But one of the really cool things we've come across in understanding perception with this perception action approach is these different brain pathways that are associated with doing things and with perceiving. As described in your book, there are two very broad pathways, the ventral pathway and the dorsal pathway. Ventral means top in anatomy, and dorsal means, I guess, the bottom surface. So, top, what faces the top and what faces the bottom, right? Ventral and dorsal. So there's this ventral pathway that roughly curves like in the, through the upper part of your cortex on each side. And this ventral pathway has been described as the what brain pathway that's responsible for the recognition of a particular object. So what is that? What is it? What is it called? The recognition is located in the lower occipital lobe, and it leads to the temporal lobe where language functions are controlled. So you go from the lower occipital lobe, you curve up, and then you go down into the temporal lobe. And that pathway, that neural pathway, seems to be really important in helping us to take the information from the occipital lobe, transferring it to the temporal lobe, and ultimately helping us to give a label or a name to something. The other pathway is the dorsal pathway, and this pathway has been called the where pathway. It's the where brain pathway that is responsible for helping us to locate an object in space. So you've got the what as to what it is, and then you've got the where as to where it is in relation to other objects. The where pathway roughly corresponds, it runs from the upper occipital lobe, and it swoops down and it goes up into the parietal lobe, where the motor cortex resides. So we think that there's some coordination there between what's being perceived visually and what's being told to the motor cortex as to where things are and where to orient your body to get to the affordances that are provided by the objects that you're perceiving. So all of these different approaches to perception, they all have their pluses and minuses, and you can compare them. So for example, if we compare the different approaches to perception with regard to the perception of motion, right? The computational perception researchers have looked at how visual cues help to detect motion and the speed of motion in the environment. So as you know, things that look like they're moving faster, they have a certain appearance versus things that are moving a lot slower. Also, things that are moving faster are going to change their images that are being projected in your eye a lot quicker than things that are moving slower. So all of these cues, all of these different qualities are used by the computational perception people to be able to detect motion. Gestalt researchers, on the other hand, focus more on apparent motion as seen in a visual illusion that's known as a phi phenomenon. So in a phi phenomenon, we organize the stimuli moving on and off as moving in a way that we know that an object moves in a scene. So we have these stimuli that are coming in, and let's say you're watching a bird fly across the sky, right? You're watching this bird fly across the sky. So the Gestaltists are saying, well, we take this stimuli, but we know, based on top-down processing and our past experience, we know how birds move. We know what we expect to see birds do. So I'm using this, what's called a phi phenomenon, which is basically just this repeated one image after another, and putting it together into this fluid motion of a bird flying across the sky, because that's what I expect to see. That's what I've seen birds do, and that's what I know birds do. The perception action approach considers movement in terms of goals for our own action. So basically, the perception action approach is saying, okay, the proper way to perceive motion is to understand what it is that you're trying to do. So if I want to perceive motion related to grabbing a cup on a table, I have to understand first what cups are for, and then I can grab them, and then I have to hold them a certain way. All of that goes into my understanding of, ultimately, my perception of motion, because I know that cups are there to be grabbed, and cups are there to be held, and cups are there to hold liquids that I can then bring to my mouth and drink. All of that goes into my understanding of the perception of motion for that particular object. Probably the perception of motion involves all of these things. It's probably partly computational, Gestalt based on our experience and our learning, and then based on what we want to do with it, based on our perceptions and our actions.